organization called Republican Voters Against Trump is paying to run an ad during the Republican National Convention, got Trump on my mind, convictions, in swing states that just absolutely obliterates Donald Trump. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's being run in swing states where people might be making decisions that are crucial to the outcome of the election during the convention. And it's interesting to think about his own supporters, who primarily will be watching this, or not primarily, but a lot of his supporters will be watching the convention, and they'll have to be confronted with the brutal and humiliating facts about their dear leader. It would be wonderful if this could sway them. I think more so we're hoping those swing voters get swayed by something like this. So here's the ad, then we'll talk about some other things.
Republicans have made their choice. Donald Trump will be their nominee. In 2020, Americans voted Trump out of office because they saw his chaos and abuse of power.
Trump becoming the first president to be impeached twice.
They saw him fail to lead us through COVID.
Supposing you brought the light inside the body.
Then they saw him lie about the 2020 election.
The only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged.
And cause an insurrection.
We fight like hell. We will never concede.
And since leaving office, he's only become more extreme. He's a convicted felon.
Donald Trump, convicted of 34 felonies.
He wants to use the presidency to attack his enemies.
And if you're president again, will you lock people up?
The answer is you have no choice.
He's even called for the termination of the Constitution. Trump will be on the ballot in November. We have to remember why we voted him out before, and we can never let him anywhere near power again. Republican Accountability PAC is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Brutal. Now, here's what that really brings to my mind. The phrase they use was, we have to remind ourselves, remember why we voted him out in the first place. And that's so important because for avid political viewers, you won't relate to this as much, but for a lot of Americans, there has been a little bit of forgetfulness about Trump and what he stands for, what he did, and how he failed the country. A psychologist who wrote a piece talking about why we've omitted from our memory as a country the pandemic and Trump's failure of leadership. They called it collective amnesia. We're having this collective amnesia as a way, a trauma response to lessen the pain because of how painful that moment was and how we dealt with the conditions for so long, still are dealing with the aftermath of the economic nightmare that was, the public health destruction, and the crime wave that came of that. And so you understand why people have that urge to sort of just, I'm going to forget that ever happened altogether. But what that means is Trump gets helped politically because he can sell people a version of his presidency that didn't exist. He can sell people on the idea that essentially any of those negative things that came from the pandemic, just sort of remember them starting when Biden became president, which is what they do, right? Not just the public health nightmare, but all the things it caused. It's been a great way, dishonest, but effective, for networks like Fox News and for MAGA at large to take all the things that came of it and say, Biden did that. Point to inflation, Biden did that. Point to crime, Biden did that. Even many of these things like crime starting under Trump, a huge spike. Or coming from policy decisions he made, contributing to inflation. And if you can convince people the supply chain problems, the energy industry shakeup, that all those things were because of Biden instead of because of the pandemic and the conditions it put into place, then you can run a much easier campaign against him. Again, not honest, but proving to be somewhat effective. And so for Americans, I think it's less so convincing them of the character of Trump, convincing them of details of Trump that they'd never known before, but instead of reminding them of why they kicked him out in the first place, reminding them of what they've known, what they've felt, but have maybe forgotten a little bit. And then adding on top of that, the new things. Because since we booted him from the White House in November of 2020, he's shown himself to be even worse than we knew at that point in time, right? After the 2020 election is when he tried to do a political coup, tried to prevent Biden from coming into office, even though he won the lawful election results, tried to get his vice president to obstruct the lawful certification of the election, tried to get fraudulent electors to be counted, tried to get a mob to prevent the certification of the election, tried to get local officials to engage in fraud and overturn their election results, showing just an utter lack of respect for our democratic process, and then has continued to lie about that democratic process since. So we've learned even more. He became a civilly liable rapist after the 2020 election. He became a convicted felon after the election. He said a bunch of insane, dangerous things since then, like terminate the Constitution, like media outlets should be targeted by the government. Just a complete violation of our First Amendment and the freedom of the press. We've learned about his plan for second-term governance, Project 2025, that now he's denying being associated with. We've learned that he wants retribution for his own legal accountability. And all these things should be enough if everyone remembered them or learned about them to defeat Trump in November. And then I do think the Biden campaign has quite the next few months ahead of them, right? The stakes being what they are, and Biden choosing to stay on the ticket, choosing to push aside the explosion of conversations post-debate that have been happening in the media and elsewhere about what comes ahead and maybe it being different. And he's saying, I'm the guy, I'm staying in. That means the pressure is even more intense. So what's the message from them? How do we see victory in November? Well, you got to do what that ad did, which is wake America up. Hello, everyone. Attention. Let's not forget who Trump is. Let's not forget what we saw from him and then what we've learned since. Our profound ambition to forget the pain of that period of time cannot be us forgetting who was exacerbating that pain. Okay. So that's a part of it. There's an anti-Trump message. Of course. It's probably the leading message. Then also the affirmative case for Biden that the Biden campaign needs to be making is about results. We cannot deny, and if everyone out there is acting like it's crazy to say this, stop. We cannot deny there are major perception issues now about the communication that we're seeing from Biden, about competency concerns. And so he needs to go out there, yes, and address that. That's a big job for him, perception-wise, convincing people through as many events as he can that he's got it and he can be president. And then a big part of the message needs to be policy over perception. So try to fix the perception issues, but those aren't really going to be completely solved. So a big part of the message from Biden and surrogates needs to be policy over more aesthetic stuff. The on-paper record versus Biden as the individual and the figure. And so both are important, just so you know, in a president. And I'm not denying that, but I'm saying the message that needs to be heard around the country for a Biden victory to take place is look at the governance. Do you want this governance or do you want that governance? Because that's the option. And one of the things that I do think increasingly Americans are understanding is that the economic record of Biden is better than initially thought, or at least better than was initially the consensus. Business Insider reports the U.S. economy is crushing it compared to other rich countries. I've said before, post-pandemic, since Biden has taken over, we have been dominating our recovery compared to those countries. Not everything's perfect, but if you look at other wealthy countries that have been trying to deal with these unique, unprecedented pandemic and post-pandemic related conditions, we're doing it the best. And so Biden needs to make the case, his surrogates need to make the case that a part of that is because of him. And also a part of that is because of our patriotic belief that the United States is strong, right? So attribute some of it to the people, to us all in our strength. And then you got to point some of that back to the policy record of the Biden administration. Trump failing the response to the pandemic, exacerbating these problems, Biden taking over a broken country in shambles, economy that had collapsed, crime spike, and all these things, and then getting things back on course again more effectively than these other wealthy nations. If you've been watching this show and you're not yet subscribed, I ask that you do just click that subscribe button. Very easy, free, but it makes quite the difference. Back to the video. Now, one of the big criticisms of Biden has been inflation. But very quickly, we got inflation down to lower than these same G7 countries, as you can see here demonstrated on the visual. I will just note, this is totally a side thought, but I was reading in our effort to get inflation down, now it's sort of down back to healthy figures, but as that was happening, the Fed's attempts to get inflation under control, you do have to understand and analyze, as the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco did in this analysis, the delay that monetary policy sees with the outcome of those policies, the economic response to a given policy decision is on a delay. So when people blame Biden for the inflation spike, it seems to miss that these things take time to take effect. And if you look at when the most aggressive pandemic response things were happening, as you see here, it was, of course, during the presidency of Trump. And I don't blame him for that. And then you have, as this particular analysis says, an 18-month delay, but this was talking about the Fed specifically and trying to get inflation down. The exact figures aren't super important, but instead that I wish people would be sort of honest, or try to set politics aside a little bit when talking about something like inflation, which was painful. But then the whole discussion becomes, oh, let's blame it on Biden, or let's blame it on Trump. I think, yes, it's true, Trump added twice to the debt compared to Biden. Former President Trump, as Axios reports, ran up the national debt by about twice as much as President Biden, according to a new analysis of their fiscal track records. So if you do want to do blame, yes, Trump was putting more money into the economy than Biden in his response. You could say some of that was because it was a worse time, so it was necessary. But I'm not even doing that blame game right now. I'm saying both presidents had to do some recovery efforts. And inflation, as we saw in countries around the world, was bound to spike because of that. And then it was, what did Biden Democrats and some bipartisan Republicans do to try to get things under control? And then, of course, the Fed being independent. And I think the story there is a good one, of getting us out of it, but then quickly getting inflation under control with the pain that we had to feel. And it was brutal. And we need to keep working to minimize that pain. And then, not to go too long, but then you have to say, and the governance also. All those years that have led to the very perception-related things that we're talking about with Biden, the very real concerns and doubts, those years also brought with them an ability to govern, as we've now seen. That has to be the message that the Biden campaign is putting out there. And that means talking about the huge historic infrastructure investments, talking about efforts like the American Rescue Plan to get us out of the pandemic crisis, the historic Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, all the things we talk about, millions of jobs created, crime plummeting. And that is a story that I think Americans can see as both accurate and compelling. And that's what we need. Let me know if you agree in the comments. If you want to get an extra episode of the show daily and support the work that we do, you can do so by clicking the join button below.